Support for Carolina Business Review provided by Grant Thornton, an international accounting, tax, and business advisory organization dedicated to serving middle-market companies. Grant Thornton, a passion for the business of accounting. Novant HEALTH is a not-for-profit group of hospitals and medical clinics caring for surrounding communities. Their nurses, physicians, and staff are nationally recognized for their remarkable devotion to patient care. And by Sonoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services with more than 300 operations in 35 countries.
You know, all politics may be local, but the Carolinas will have this nation's center stage when it comes to the 2012 election cycle. Certainly, we have seen the high drama in South Carolina's primary recently, but that may be just an appetizer to the main event, so to speak, the conclave for the Democrats in Charlotte this fall. Welcome again, and thanks for supporting the most widely watched source for Carolina business and public policy. I'm Chris William, and this time on CBR, we're joined later on by Florence Mayor Stephen Wukela.
Major funding also by the Duke Endowment, a private foundation in Charlotte, enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. And by Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina, who's responsible for rising healthcare costs. Join Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. This edition of Carolina Business Review was recorded January 20th, 2012. On this week's program, David Cordeaux of the Spartanburg Area Chamber of Commerce, John Gesseman of Carolina's Gateway Partnership, and special guest Stephen Wukela, Mayor of the City of Florence. Now, Chris William.
Hello, welcome to our program. David, good to have you here. Thanks for coming.
Glad to be here.
John, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
I know it was not a short commitment and a drive, but we appreciate that. David, I want to start with you. Gosh, you know, watching politics in South Carolina is almost like watching a college football. It can be just thoroughly exciting, and you're worn out after it all. Now that some of the din has died down before the Democrats take Charlotte by storm at the DNC this fall, what is getting back to business? What are the one or two biggest priorities that South Carolina really needs to grapple with here?
To make sure that we support in full measure the growth in the manufacturing economy, the growth in exports, and the infrastructure to support both.
Okay, let me stop you right there, because a lot of people will say, why do we need to support BMW? They seem to be making those announcements anyway, or the Continental Tire announcement, or any kind of Michelin capital infrastructure. Why?
Because it's all part of a global ecosystem, and the need to be competitive globally is first and foremost with those companies. The beauty of it is they're finding a way to be competitive in the United States, in the Southeast, and we need to keep that going.
Mm-hmm. John, talking about some of the din and some of the noise from this election year, again, same question to you. How do we get away from partisan politics and get back to maybe one or two things that are critically important for North Carolina? Even in North Carolina, as they debate with education, what else are we missing here that's getting lost in the sound, in the shuffle?
Well, I'm not sure that I can say anything will be missed, because there's probably going to be enough discussion that will cover all of the topics. But I think that from the perspective of a local economic development practitioner, key things are maintaining local revenues to do the kinds of infrastructure improvements that we've been talking about is very important. Fund education, which is done a lot on a local basis. And then I'm confident that there's continuing conversation in North Carolina about our ability to attract jobs, which we've been very successful in North Carolina. It always ranks at the top or near the top because people pay attention to that. So I'm sure competitive nature in the state, just as was mentioned about South Carolina, you say the same thing about North Carolina. And then I know from our perspective is maintaining and improving any way possible the ability of local governments to fund operations.
At the end of last year, John, I'll stay with you. At the end of last year, it was a very public debate, and not, I think, North Carolina's, personally, I didn't think it was North Carolina's finest moment when Continental Tire announced that they would, in fact, leave the Tar Heel state, relocate to the Palmetto state. And there was some public bickering, political public bickering, and it was not attractive. But more than that, how do, you know, it kind of brings back up this whole idea of incentives. Charlotte has landed Chiquita from Cincinnati, Ohio, and it was not an inexpensive deal. So let's talk a little bit about incentives, and I'm going to give you a chance here, David, on incentives, I promise. Our incentives, you know, it always brings up whenever there's a major relocation, and the Chiquita deal cost Charlotte, North Carolina, somewhere in excess of $21 million. Is that worth it, paying for that kind of marquee name?
Well, I can't comment specifically on any
Or is
deal
there
that
another way to do it?
But I know that the state of North Carolina goes through a equation to determine whether the incentives being offered will be on the positive side. So without a doubt, there's that calculation that goes on at the state. I'm pretty confident the calculation goes on a local basis too in North Carolina and in Charlotte, where we can look at expense revenue. Mm-hmm. What's the profit kind of a thing, if you will. And if that comes out positively, then it's a win for everyone.
Is there, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but is there another way then we need to think about the calculus of economic incentives so the escalation of numbers doesn't keep going up per head? So
well, at some point the calculation gets less than zero, I suppose, and at that point that's not a good deal. I think there have been calculations that I'm not aware of them in North Carolina, but I'm aware of them that there have been conversation that maybe they came out less than zero on some deals. Mm-hmm. And in that case, you really have to wonder. It is an ever-increasing number, it seems, to all of us. And, you know, it is a situation where there's probably fewer sellers than buyers, if you will. Yeah. Just because of the national economy, and that has a lot to do with things. But, you know, we're in a global economy as well, as was pointed out. You know, Spartanburg is seeing people from all over the world. We're competing not certainly within the state, not within the Southeast. We're competing globally, and to the extent that what we're doing locally is just leveling the playing field, if you will, it may get more expensive.
Okay, David, it's a great place for you to come in. Same question on incentives. At what point is it a tipping point and it's not a good investment anymore? And I'm not talking about per job or per announcement, but aren't we getting, aren't some of the prices for these jobs getting kind of astronomical and almost to a sense of desperation?
No.
No?
Not that I've seen. I've done economic development in 5 states. We've seen that kind of competition amongst the states. We've seen it amongst communities. Typically what it comes down to is not a competition for direct dollars. Companies aren't out there saying, whoever pays me the highest, that's where I'm going. It's a competition amongst the finalists. You meet all the other criteria, and the other criteria may be 90% of the equation. Mm-hmm. At some point, maybe incentives are 10% of the equation or less. Mm-hmm. So it becomes down, who are the finalists? Why are they finalists? Does the incentive make a difference? Maybe a little bit in the end, but it's not an auction.
If I could add on to that, yeah, I think if it ever gets to, in the things that are good, it's not about incentives. It's about all the other stuff, yeah. And those are kind of a last thing that comes into the equation.
So
honestly.
Incentives don't really win the deal either. Somebody has a proclivity to go somewhere or they don't.
I mean, the worst thing you can do is just make a decision based upon the incentives. That's not a winning formula for the company or the community where they're going to go. Yeah. But there are some things, there's a lot of places in this world, and maybe it's a tiebreaker.
David, gas tax in South Carolina, it looks like the State House has put to bed any idea of any increase in a gas tax, which would make you think that that at risk here is some infrastructure money that they could get from the federal government. Is that the wrong way to look at that, or is there a bigger equation here?
The equation is way bigger. As companies look at investing, they're looking at that large picture we just discussed. Labor force, education, quality of life, access to ports, access to necessary infrastructure. So when we look at it, we look at what's the critical infrastructure needs that support the growth in the economy. And it may be that we won't have money because we didn't pass the gas tax to repair a bridge in a particular county or pave a highway, as long as we're confident that we do have the money to make sure that the access to the ports, the access to the major roads, the access to the metro areas is sufficient to allow commerce to flow.
Talk about major roads. I-95 corridor runs smack through the heart of your area of dominant influence down there, John. What are the challenges with developing I-95 to get it to a point where it's, you know, we can lean into it from an economic development standpoint?
Well, certainly it is the
More
East
so,
Coast Main Street, and we're fortunate that it goes right through Rocky Mount and Nash and Edgecombe counties, where I'm located. But it needs help. It needs improvement. It needs more capacity. There aren't many alternatives to 95, and because it is all of our lifeblood, we need to pay a lot of attention to it, and it's got to be improved. It's got to be financed. It's going to be a big number. I don't think anybody yet has the solution. A lot of very bright people are working on it, and we are working through how that's going to be financed, but it's just something that has to be done.
How about
Absolutely.
how about a toll?
Tolls are being looked at. That is one possible solution. There's a lot of people that don't think that's a good solution.
Would you say, not to overuse this metaphor, but at the end of the day, would you expect that North Carolina will end up having more toll roads, maybe I-95?
Certainly, there already are more toll roads than there were in the past, and I had the pleasure of working with a man by the name of Wilfred Owen, who wrote the textbook, in fact, on highways in the city. He used the Japanese model of saying that's how they built their highway system, was through tolls, and he said we should have done that more in the United States over the past 30 to 40 years. I think there's going to be more use of it. Is that the solution on 95? I don't know. We'll find out.
Okay. Thank you, gentlemen. Next week on this program, Carol Quinlan is the new president at Davidson College in Charlotte. And then in 2 weeks, Dr. Larry Wheeler from North Carolina Museum of Art will be here. Now, imagine that you are the chief executive of a city that was founded on transportation and rail at the crossroads of commerce for an entire region. And let's say that that region is the PD in South Carolina, and that city is Florence. Now let's say that some of your own neighbors don't even know about the recent successes that you've had with economic development. How would you change the perception? Well, probably a good place to start would be in the mayor's office, and he joins us now, the mayor of Florence, Stephen Wukela. Stephen, Your Honor, excuse me, sir.
Stephen's just fine.
Well, certain respect goes with the office. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
You know, it's interesting, and I hope you take this for what it is, but so many people know Florence as being that place in Florence County in Darlington on the way to the beach, or, you know, that city next to Quinby.
Sure, where they get off 95 to go to Myrtle Beach.
Yeah, exactly. How do you change the perception of what Florence really is? And I would say that goes true for Rocky Mount, but that's a whole other dialogue.
You go in Carolina Business Review, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah. Good point.
Well, no, the fact of the matter is that Florence is much different than the perception that many people get coming off 95 and going to Myrtle Beach. It's a very diverse economy, in fact. We've got a large healthcare base. We have 2 major hospitals. We've got a large manufacturing base. GE is there, and they manufacture MRIs, and Honda, QVC, Monster, Heinz, just to go down the list. And we attract a lot of folks for that reason, that come to the area for that reason. And so we've benefited from that diversity, and we want to make sure that word gets out.
So how do you do that? How do you change the perception of and again, forgive me for this, but a sleepy little town in the PD?
Sure. Well, and it's not only a perception you have to change to folks from outside of the community. It's a transition that goes on in the community, from a community that was a very rural, agricultural-based community, as recently as the last 50 years, to a community that's become very industrialized and is growing significantly. You know, in the last census, we've grown, I think, about 25%. And there's an education that goes on within the community as you transition into more strict requirements as far as housing and maintenance codes, and more metropolitan requirements, such as paying for parking and paying for infrastructure in a larger city. And folks have to become used to that, and I think the short answer is you take it slowly.
David, question?
I'm looking at the southeast, and I'm saying one of the things we're seeing, bright spots popping up everywhere in entrepreneurism. And I think for all of us, it used to be recruiting companies and retaining companies. Now it's creating companies. Can you tell me what's going on in your community and what you're seeing?
I think that's exactly right, David. And I think the fundamental tie into that we've seen in Florence that we've been able to do that maybe some others in our neighbors around the PD haven't been able to do is infrastructure. I mean, we've spent large amounts of money in infrastructure. We're in the middle of building a $120 million wastewater treatment plant in Florence because our capacity was at 95%, and frankly, DHEC said if you don't build some more capacity, we're going to stop letting you issue new permits, which, as you can imagine, would devastate our ability to recruit industry. We've been very proactive. We have a very strong economic development partnership in Florence County headed by a fine fellow by the name of Joe King that goes out and recruits these industries and helps grow industries within the county. We do the economic incentives that they do throughout the state, but you also have to build not only the hard infrastructure as far as water and sewer and roads, but you have to build the softer infrastructure, education, healthcare, quality of life, to be able to attract those industries and to show the rest of the country and the rest of the state that Florence isn't the sleepy little town that it used to be, but is a good place to do business and to enjoy a fine quality of life.
John?
The Florence has had a great record of success, and actually in Rocky Mount we've competed with you all, and you've won on occasion. But
we hate to bring that up, John. But
I want to congratulate you on the,
Well,
the work that you've done there, and I think we have a very good, in North Carolina, I'm most familiar with, very good support network at the state through a lot of different agencies. And how does the state of South Carolina support your efforts, both from an infrastructure standpoint and kind of the background stuff that needs to go on, and then directly?
Let me answer it this way. Let me tell you how I'd like to see the state support us. We have along the entire I-95 corridor, where of course Florence sits off I-95, desperate conditions with regard to the whole state. We have probably, I think folks in the I-95 corridor earn about 2/3 what the median income is for the state. We have about an average of about 15% unemployment as opposed to the statewide 9.9%, maybe the national 8.5%, 8.6%.
Is that in Darlington and Florence, or Florence County?
Well, actually, Florence County does better than the rest of the 95 corridor. The average in the 95 corridor is about 15%.
Okay.
Marion, which is our neighbor to the east, is about 17% highest in the state. Florence is below the state average. It's 9.6%. So we stand in contrast to the rest of the PD. And the point I was going to make is we've been able to buck the trend in the PD and do better than the state because we've been able to invest in that infrastructure, because we've acted collectively on both sides of the aisle. Senator Hugh Leatherman, who's a senator from Florence, is the Senate Finance Committee chairman, does a very good job advocating for Florence County at the State House. And we've been able to succeed because of that, because of the collective action, because of really nonpartisan action, whereas I'm a Democrat, and a strong Democrat. Senator Leatherman is a very conservative Republican. But we set that aside in Florence and work for the county. That's not very much been true statewide, and I'd very much like to see the state as a whole do the same kind of investment in the I-95 corridor that we've done in Florence County to buck the trend. An example of that is there was recently a study done on the I-95 corridor by Francis Marion University in South Carolina State that pointed out some of those shortcomings along the I-95 corridor, the lack of investment in infrastructure. And we asked the legislature to pass a bill that created a consortium that would advocate for that 95 corridor and do that kind of economic development collectively for the entire corridor. The legislature passed it, and unfortunately the governor vetoed it, and we weren't able to overcome that veto. So I'd like to see the state do that kind of affirmative economic development in the I-95 corridor, particularly building infrastructure. You know, we're able to do it in Florence. We're able to recruit Hines because we can build a wastewater treatment plant. They can't do it in Marion. They can't do it in Dillon. And I think the same is true in North Carolina.
You know, and it's worth saying, Your Honor, that study that Francis Marion and South Carolina State went to RTI in Research Triangle Park, who Victoria Haynes has been on this program several times, and you talk about the blue chips of the blue chips when it comes to research. They do a very thorough job, and I know that was not a small study, and I know you were disappointed. But let me get back to some federal support here. Barack Obama has proposed a 7.5% decrease in block granting. Congress has proposed a 60% cut. It would be draconian, to say the least. What happens to counties like Florence that have, all of us, have undesirable neighborhoods, have strings of places that need this kind of help? How do you buttress against that kind of cut?
It's devastating. The community development block grants have been cut dramatically over the last decade. And there were those in the House that wanted to eliminate them altogether. You got to realize you're talking about grants that serve folks where the unemployment is perennially been in double digits, where they don't have access to decent health care, where they really have subpar education, where the standard is minimally adequate education, and they have not been able to meet that standard. And the opportunity for them to have any kind of economic development or have any kind of future in the community is very minimal. And if they don't get the support from the federal government or from the state government, they have no potential of being able to build that kind of opportunity. And it goes back to infrastructure again. There's just no hope for Marion County if they can't build an infrastructure that will be able to attract business, which will be able to attract jobs, which will develop them a tax base that they can reinvest in their infrastructure. And unless money comes from the state or from the federal government, that's just not going to happen. The same has been true not only of CDBG cuts, but of the federal government's inaction, Congress's inaction on the water bill, the WRDA, Water Resource Development Act, and the highway bill, both of which have been overdue for reauthorization into the third, I think fourth year maybe, David. Yeah. And for example, go back to that wastewater treatment plant. It's a $120 million facility. Without it, we can't recruit business. We can't put our people to work. It's not political in any respect. Lindsey Graham supports it just like Jim Clyburn supports it. It's the fundamental thing that you hope government will do, provide water and wastewater treatment. But we can't get Congress to act to help us fund that kind of investment. Luckily, Florence can do it, but our neighbors in the PD, frankly, can't.
Point well taken. David?
All of us in South Carolina have a responsibility to elevate the product of education. And I'm wondering if you're seeing new types of partnerships emerge between the private sector and the education community.
We are. In fact, Florence School District 1 serves the city of Florence. And we have a foundation that has been very proactive in raising private money to do some things. It's called the School Foundation, and they fund different kinds of programs in Florence School District 1, and have been very successful and been able to raise a lot of money. But David, Florence School District 1 stands in stark contrast to the rest of Florence County in South Carolina, and stark contrast to many of the other school districts in the state. First of all, you've got a funding system in the state that really casts each county off on their own to raise property tax and generate revenue to fund their own school districts. The state has not funded even its own formula for education per pupil in many, many years. And of course, you're familiar with the court challenges as to whether many schools, including Timmonsville in Florence County, are even minimally adequate. I think that there has to be a statewide approach to this issue. I would argue that we have to have equality in education funding. There's no reason that I can justify a young person in York County getting a different quality of education than a young person in Williamsburg County or in Timmonsville. And that is a critically desperate situation. And it puts places like Florence compared to the rest of Florence County in a disproportionate advantage, puts places like, I don't mean to pick on Rock Hill, but York in a disproportionate advantage to places like Williamsburg County. And what has happened further, and I hate to monopolize this, Chris, but counties have subdivided themselves then in response. Right. Yes. And so, for example, in Florence County, we have 5 school districts.
And it becomes even more competitive and more disjointed. We'll have you back, I promise, because we didn't even get a chance. You're unknowingly blowing off of the president's invitation to come to the White House. We didn't talk about that. Nice to have you on the program, Your Honor. Good to see you.
Appreciate it.
John, welcome. Good luck with that whole 95 thing. Thank you. It benefits all of us, I think. David, nice to have you here. Welcome.
My pleasure.
Thank you. Until next week, I'm Chris William. We certainly hope your weekend and your business is good. Good night.
Major funding for Carolina Business Review was provided by the Duke Endowment, a private foundation in Charlotte, enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. And by Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina, who's responsible for rising healthcare costs. Join Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. Grant Thornton, an international accounting, tax, and business advisory organization dedicated to serving middle market companies. Grant Thornton, a passion for the business of accounting. Novant HEALTH is a not-for-profit group of hospitals and medical clinics caring for surrounding communities. Their nurses, physicians, and staff are nationally recognized for their remarkable devotion to patient care. And by Sonoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services with more than 300 operations in 35 countries. And by viewers like you. Thank you. Promotional consideration provided by Business North Carolina Magazine. For more information, visit carolinabusinessreview.com.